So we're kind of on the hour, so we'll kick it off. I'm John McNamara. I'm one of the senior inventors in the labs, and this is Dan Pollitt. Dan, do you want to tell everyone who you are and what you do at IBM?
Sure. So yes, Dan Pollitt. I've kind of got a 50-50 role. I'm half-time development manager and half-time software architect.
Nice.
In our automated testing portfolio.
Golly, how does that work? Is that difficult?
It is actually. I try not to do a kind of a poor job in both sides, and it's a bit of a balancing act. But generally, we're doing okay.
Fantastic. All right. So the topic's green hat. So first question then: what is green hat?
Yeah. Okay. Good place to start. So Green Hat was an acquisition made by IBM back in 2012. We were a small software company specializing in automated testing and something which was relatively new at the time called service virtualization. I'm sure we'll dig into those later on. So we were a small UK-based company acquired in 2012. And as we moved into IBM, our products have been rebranded.
Okay.
We moved into the Rational portfolio. The Green Hat is an interesting one. So the company name, people quite often say, well, why is it? Is it related to Red Hat, something like that? But it's actually from Edward de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats, and if you remember that as a
he did water logic, didn't he?
Yeah. So the Green Hat. So these are ways of approaching a problem.
Right.
Different hats you might put on to attack a problem, and the Green Hat is specifically about creative ideas and sort of blue sky thinking, which the founder of the company at the time thought was a good fit for the culture he wanted to create. So yeah, I mean that's the sort of history of Green Hat, and our focus is really on automated integration testing. So helping customers who have complex IT systems, complex distributed systems, to automate the testing of those, generally at the messaging or API level.
Okay.
And on the other side, the service virtualization piece is looking to help enable bringing that testing earlier in the life cycle. So service virtualization is about simulating service endpoints, something developers have been doing for ages. When you're unit testing, you might use mocking or stubbing.
Yeah.
And this is really working at the system level. One of the blockers in moving integration testing earlier in the development cycle, obviously we'd like to catch those gnarly integration bugs much earlier, is that these complex environments we're trying to test it have got some dependencies that are really problematic for doing testing. They might not be there.
Right.
They might not have been developed yet. They might be really expensive to spin up in a test environment. You might want to have some deterministic behavior that you want to test specific scenarios against, particular repeatable data sets, that kind of thing. You might not own the system and you might be looking to do some performance testing.
Right, yeah.
So what we do is we allow people to quickly and easily create simulations of these complex dependencies. So you can build a sandbox around the pieces you really want to test.
Yeah.
Bring up a simplified test environment for that system much earlier than you could do previously, much more cheaply. And use that to run your automated testing against.
So you could, I guess then, so coming from a messaging background with MQ, if you knew that you were going to support a series of applications with an MQ infrastructure, you could create the infrastructure and then maybe use Green Hat to provide the performance around that.
Absolutely. And it's technologies like MQ, web services, REST APIs, general HTTP traffic. It's really that messaging layer that we really specialize.
Very good.
In a complex system, quite often we're using messaging or those are kind of API boundaries. It's relatively easy to draw those lines around the bits that you want to be real and the bits that you want to virtualize, and what your kind of entry and observation points are for doing this testing.
Fantastic. So who do you see as being the people to actively use this stuff?
That is a good question, and it's a population that has its roots really in the technical tester.
Right.
So I guess the broadest use of the product set is within the QA department or the QA role, automating integration tests, particularly around large regression tests for existing systems, making sure that recent changes aren't affecting the behavior you want to preserve. And so technical testers, because does need to be an awareness of some of the technologies that are going on and what the responsibilities are of the different components, particularly the way in which they interact with the outside world. But we're seeing more and more uptake, especially earlier in the development cycle, especially with service virtualization. We're finding that the same kind of dependency issues that are affecting testing are also affecting the ability for development teams to work on perhaps their components that they're working on. So you could imagine perhaps a front-end developer looking to drive out aspects of their user interface, or perhaps a web application elements being deployed into the cloud, perhaps looking to iterate at a faster pace. But they perhaps have some dependencies on another team within their organization, or an API that's not quite there yet. We can build quite sophisticated simulations of the back end to allow that development to get going much earlier and sort of drive out almost prototyping some of the interfaces.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So we've spoken about what it is, and we've spoken about who it's for. And I think we've mentioned that the test cycle as well. But at what stage would you recommend Green Hat functionality be used in the kind of software development, application development lifecycle? Where would you ideally, optimally like to see it being used?
So obviously I'm biased because I would say end to end.
Never.
But seriously, I think mentioning that use earlier in the cycle, test-driven development, having its origins at least in an explicit form as part of the agile movement, sort of 10 to 15 years back. We can see test-driven development. You're more than welcome to use rational integration tester is the end user authoring and testing environment that someone would download and install. But we can see that that being used very early on as a prototyping and early testing tool. And to do that simulation early in the life cycle. We're really trying to bring an end to that big bang integration phase of the traditional project.
Okay.
And we describe a lot of what we do as integration testing, not necessarily because it is limited to a common phase of development called integration testing, where you're normally trying to bring large components together, realizing you've got a horrifically expensive problem to fix. We're trying to bring that, start in an iterative cycle, or even in a more traditional cycle, just bringing that phase earlier. So I think, from midway through development, or really right through until the last hours before a push to production.
Fantastic. All right, so we've I guess we've kind of spoken about it really all the way through as a theme. But if you were to hit the nail on the head and say, what's the problem that Green Hat helps you solve? If you were to concise it, what would it be?
It's complexity, and how complexity is such a blocker for testing. In non-trivial systems, you've got multiple components, multiple cogs and wheels turning, all trying to do their own thing. They've evolved. Those systems that we're looking to test have probably been around a couple of years.
Right.
They might be in parts in organizations that themselves have made acquisitions. They've changed their organization. Their businesses have evolved. All of which very quickly leads to a complex system. And complex not only in the number of moving parts, but the variety, the spectrum of technologies, protocols, message formats, data structures is just a nightmare for an enterprise system for testing, especially when you're trying to test earlier. And so what we do is present a very consistent user interface across the technologies, across those message formats, to make sure that once we're happy with the basics of how we're going to do some testing, how we're going to do some virtualization, that we can take that knowledge and apply it everywhere in the system.
Okay.
And that's from DB2 on the mainframe to your latest REST APIs on the front end.
Fantastic. Now, we all know there's Green Hat, but how does it manifest itself? What's the relationship between this and, say, Rational, for example?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the products that you would look for if you're hunting around online trying to find a bit more about it, the primary testing tool for integration testing is Rational Integration Tester.
Right.
And that sits within a bundle, a little portfolio of testing products called Rational Test Workbench.
Okay.
And what that does is brings together several tools that really span the spectrum of testing.
Right.
So from user interface-based testing for web UIs, using Selenium, that kind of thing, through to integration testing, but also covering performance testing. So both looking at latency and sort of deep dive into the backends for response time breakdowns, through to sort of large-scale load testing.
Okay.
So it's so Rational Test Workbench is what you're looking for.
Cool. Awesome. In that case, are you ready for some questions from Twitter?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. I guess I'm going to wander over here. I shall loom up at the people who are currently viewing it. Let's have a wee look online and see if we can get hold of. So I'm doing a quick browse now on the hashtag IBM messaging. Okay, so looking forward to the Green Hat talk. Fantastic, thank you very much. What does this mean for an MQ user? Is there a joined up support, etc.? So I guess if you're using the Green Hat functionality along with MQ and you need support, how does that work? Is it two different things? Was it joined up or what story?
So MQ's I guess the sort of shining jewel of support across the 70 or so technologies we support. And so what does it mean for MQ? I guess we'll cover them in turn. So testing. Okay. So what we're not doing is testing MQ itself. What we're doing is testing the system that's using MQ as a communications mechanism. And what we can do is when we run an integration test, what we're really doing is, part of it is simulating a client of the system, so and typically a programmatic client. So a programmatic client of a system using MQ would be putting messages onto a queue to drive some behavior in the system. We will, so as a part of a very typical test would be introducing some messages into the system, and then describing what we want to see as a result of that. So some of that might be the response or a set of response messages coming back that we can assert things about. We can also make assertions about other things that should be happening elsewhere in the system. So from a testing point of view, we're driving the system and making those observations. From a service virtualization point of view, quite often customers say who are using MQ as a communications mechanism to one of these dependencies, which might be one of these gnarly, perhaps expensive or difficult to recreate systems. We can take the place of that downstream application with a virtual service. So rather than the real system needing to be present to consume messages from MQ, undertake their business logic and perhaps feed back into the system, we can take the place of that with a sophisticated enough to be useful, but simple and simulation of that service. So in summary, I guess, testing, we're driving your system under test through MQ. And service virtualization, we're taking the place of some of those dependencies that are interacted with via MQ.
Cool. All right. So I'm sold. I think it's fantastic, and no bias there, obviously. If we want to learn more about it, where do we go next?
Okay. So there's definitely some formal or more formal product sheet and product descriptions on IBM.com.
Okay.
You'd easily be able to find those through Rational Test Workbench.
I'll put those on this video for sure.
We've also got quite recently a developer center.
Nice.
This is trying to appeal more to the end users and the developer community.
Yeah.
And so if you go to developer.ibm.com/testing,
Okay.
that's a new and growing community we have around continuous testing, which is really a theme we're pushing, bringing that testing earlier in the life cycle.
Nice.
And doing it a lot, so that by the time you get to production, your confidence is high.
Fantastic, buddy. I'll make sure that all those URLs are in the video notes on YouTube, so we can go back to it, can find them and click on it. Dan, it's been an absolute joy. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been fantastic. And thank you, everyone,
thanks for the invite.
in. That's all right, a pleasure. Hope we do more. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Toodaloo.